and very proud director of the Maplewood Library. We started the Maplewood Ideas Festival in 2014 to celebrate the talent, vision, and creativity of our community. And tonight is a true honor to welcome two people who are making a tremendous impact on our community and in our world. Christina Swarns, Executive Director of the Innocence Project, in conversation with Marie McGee. We had 3 fantastic events last week, and tomorrow night at 7 p.m. we hope you will come back to the Woodland and join us for tech policy researcher and writer Tim Wang in conversation with author and journalist John Gertner. As most of you know, the main library is closed for construction. The public bid for general contractor will be advertised within the next couple of weeks, and we look forward to welcoming all of Maplewood into our new library in 2024. In the meantime, please visit us at Hilton Branch Library for Children's and Teen Services and 129 Boyden for Adult Services. We thank the New Jersey Council for the Arts, the Friends of the Maplewood Library, the Maplewood Library Foundation, the Women's Club of Maplewood, Words Bookstore, and the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for sponsoring our festival this year. And thank you to the creative and talented staff of the Maplewood Library for putting this festival together. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Marie McGee. Marie McGee is a global communications leader and reputation strategist with extensive experience in high-profile Fortune 500 companies. Today, she leads communications and corporate affairs at the Estee Lauder Companies North America. Marie lives in Maplewood with her husband, Township Committee member and former Mayor Frank McGee, and their very talented daughter, Madison. Marie McGee.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sarah, and to everyone at the library for having us this evening. I'm really honored to be here. And before we begin, I'll tell you a funny story. Yesterday, in fact, I was over at the DeHart Center picking up our daughter, Madison, who had just auditioned for something, and she just got her driver's permit, so we didn't pull off very far from the DeHart Center when she said, "Pull over, I want to drive." And I was like, okay, fine. So I actually pulled into the Hilton Library parking lot, and as we were doing the switch, I see Christina, like, out of the corner of my eye, like, walking her dog, and I had just finished running and looked crazy, like a hot mess after my workout and very frantic. So she caught me in this real parenting moment, like, oh my God, my daughter wants to drive. So I said to her, if I'm not at the Woodlands tomorrow evening, you'll know why. So I'm so happy to be here with all of you this evening. So Christina, every time I think about her, the first thing that comes to mind is extraordinary. As Sarah mentioned, she is Maplewood resident. Oh, thank you. She's a Maplewood resident, but she grew up in Staten Island, went on to Howard University for her undergrad, then went on to Penn Law, started her career in New York at the Legal Aid Society, and then went on to Philadelphia, and I want to make sure that I have my notes here. She started with her career with the Legal Aid Society, and then she went on to work at the Capital Habeas Unit of the Philadelphia Federal Defender, where she worked on several cases to exonerate wrongful convictions, including a man who was the first, I believe, in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania to be sentenced to death row, and was able to turn that around. After that, she went on to work at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and then at the Office of the Appellate Defender, and we'll talk about all of these unbelievable milestones in her career. And now, as Sarah mentioned, she is the Executive Director at the Innocence Project. So I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Thank you.
So, Christina, you've been on this, like I said, extraordinary journey. I keep saying extraordinary is my word, but when you think about your career, how it started, how it's going, what one word would you use to describe it?
Accidental, I think, is the word I would use to describe it. When I was young, when I was growing up in Staten Island, I have a sister who was a journalist and was always very purpose-driven. She knew she was going to be a journalist from birth, I think. And I was not so clear with my goals. So in my early years, for a long time, I was committed to being a hairstylist, and so that was it. And then my parents encouraged me to think a little more broadly, and it really wasn't, I went through college not really knowing, and through law school not really knowing what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until I graduated, I went to the University of Pennsylvania Law School, right? I got this beautiful degree, and then I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I'm exactly unlike any of the people I hire. I am totally different from them. I was floundering all over the place, and when I came home from Penn, my parents were like, you can stay at home, but you should go and volunteer and do something with yourself. And so I just picked up the phone and I called the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because I thought, well, I'll be happy with whatever they ask me to do. And so for reasons of fate and history, Elaine Jones accepted the call and said, sure, you can come and intern with us. And she said, well, where do you want to work? Like, what do you want to work on? And I said, I don't care, I'll work on anything. And she said, great, then you will go and work with the Capital Punishment Project of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which, as it happened, was under threat of execution. They had a case with an active death warrant. It was a case, I remember it vividly, in Arkansas, a black man who was confessed to the crime, except there was a videotape and he was visibly beaten, and you could hear people whispering to him as he was, confessing to this crime. And they were fighting for his life. And that was the first week after I graduated from law school that I sort of had that light bulb moment as I started to work with the folks at LDF on this death penalty case. And I said, this is what I'm going to do.
It's amazing. You said so much there, and I would be remiss if I did not mention, because you brought her up, her extraordinary sister, Rachel Swarns, who is best-selling author, longtime writer at the New York Times, professor. I could go on and on, but if you don't know Rachel, please look her up, because she is as amazing as Christina is. And then also, while you were at Penn, one fact that I didn't know about you is your contracts professor was Senator Warren.
That's true.
So what was that like?
She was kind of exactly like you see her. She was very fast-paced, right? She was always moving, like kind of exactly as you see her. Really smart, and really, I remember, actively trying to keep up. She was very bright. And she was always just like you see her. She's sort of moving around the room, and she was very engaged. Yeah, she was a great contracts professor.
Amazing. So what was the catalyst that inspired you to get into this work? I mean, I would imagine that at UPenn, going from UPenn, and exploring different aspects of the legal division, or legal profession, I should say, there are so many different paths, very lucrative paths, but you decided to go in a completely different direction. So what was the catalyst?
So the one thing I did know about myself was that I did want to make an impact. I wanted to do social justice work. That would be the only thing I could have told you during college and law school, that I was going to work in public interest. I was going to make the world a better place. I was going to do something that was going to have an impact. And so when I was at Penn, I took all, my coursework was really in public interest work. My internships were really oriented toward public interest, but all over the place. I worked at the AIDS Law Project, I worked in a street law project. I sort of just did a little of everything. So that was the one sort of, clarion call that I was going to do public interest work. When I got to Penn, I will say in candor, there's such a culture of sending law students to private law firms, right, that I did ultimately interview. I was bad at those interviews. I was not an attractive candidate to large law firms, because I couldn't explain why I wanted to work there, because I didn't want to work there. I just felt like I had to go on the interviews, so I went on the interviews. So it just, I really, really knew in my heart that I wanted to do public interest work. And so really now when I talk to students in college or law school, I'm like, it is that thing. Whatever that thing is that you think in your heart, right, that you want to do, that's the thing you should follow. That's the road to take, right? Don't let, the path of least resistance drive you to do something that you really isn't in your heart to do, because we're all going to work so hard, right? And we're going to work such long hours. You got to love the thing that you're doing, and that should be the thing that's in your heart.
Absolutely. So you've had so many landmark cases throughout your career that we could talk about. But one of them the first one that was on my radar certainly was Buck versus Davis. So first, talk about that case.
So when I was at the NAACP legal defense, actually I should back up. So I spent two or 2.5 years in Manhattan as a trial public defender, and then I went to Philadelphia to do death penalty work, and I worked in the capital habeas unit of the Philadelphia Federal Defender, where we represented people on death row throughout Pennsylvania. And then I went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to run their criminal justice project, but my docket was really, death penalty cases, my personal docket. We, did all kinds of work, but my personal docket was always continuing to do death penalty cases. So while I was there, I wound up I was asked to represent a gentleman by the name of Dwayne Buck. Mr. Buck was convicted of murder in Texas, in Houston. He, without dispute, this is not an Innocence Project case, it's not an innocence case of any sort. He shot his girlfriend and another gentleman. And as soon as, the shooting was over, he was arrested in front of the apartment. This was not a whodunit. The only question in the case was, what was the sentence going to be? That was going to be the $100,000 question for this case, right? This was a gentleman who had just been, was going to be tried for capital murder. So was he going to be condemned to death, or was he going to get sentenced to life? He was poor, and he was represented by appointed counsel who did the right thing, and they sort of got experts to evaluate him. In Texas, in order to get sentenced to death, the jury has to make a prerequisite finding that the person on trial is likely to commit criminal acts of violence in the future. And that's generally called the future dangerousness finding. And so, as you might guess, prosecutors prove future dangerousness generally by reference to a prior criminal conviction, right? You say, look at this criminal history, this is a repeat offender, you can expect him or her to continue to do the same thing. The problem for Texas in this case was Mr. Buck didn't have a prior criminal record of any significance. So the challenge for them was how they were going to prove future dangerousness in the absence of that history. Unfortunately, defense counsel answered the question for them. So they hire an expert to evaluate Mr. Buck, and presumably with the goal of saying this is a gentleman that will do fine in prison, right? Their goal was admirable and correct. That they would get this expert to say this is not a person that's likely to commit crimes in the future. Unfortunately, the expert they got evaluated Mr. Buck and prepared a report, and that report sort of looked at Mr. Buck based on various categories, age, etc. One of the categories, unfortunately, was race, and it's just written in the report, race, period. Dwayne Buck is a black man, and the fact, and black people are unfortunately overrepresented in the criminal legal system, therefore Mr. Buck is more likely to commit criminal acts of violence in the future. So essentially, the defense expert concludes that Mr. Buck is more likely to commit criminal acts of violence in the future because he is black, which in Texas means, right, he should be condemned to death because he's black. So this testimony is presented by the defense to the jury at capital sentencing, no objection. The prosecutor comes up after, on cross-examination and asks, of course, the expert to repeat it and says, did I hear you right? Mr. Buck is likely to commit criminal acts of violence? Yes, absolutely. And then the prosecutor argues at closing, you can rely on defense counsel's expert to make the future dangerousness finding. So the jury does, because again, there's no other evidence, and Mr. Buck is sentenced to death. We come in when this case is in the United States Supreme Court after many, many rounds of appeals. And we were, as you all are, aghast, right, at this record. And when we took the case at LDF, I kept thinking, this should be a no-brainer, right? We're going to file an appeal somewhere, and somebody is going to say, well, this can't go, this can't, this is crazy, right? And so we filed an appeal in the state trial court. We filed an appeal in the Court of Criminal Appeals for Texas. We filed a petition to the Supreme Court after we lost in those courts. Then we filed an appeal in the Federal District Court. We filed an appeal in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we lost every single one of those appeals on this record, right? It's as clear as day, and we lost to every court we went to, with the sole exception of the United States Supreme Court at the end of this round of appeals that we fought out. It wasn't until we took the case to the United States Supreme Court, which took a long time to decide whether it was going to accept it. It did. And I argued the case in the fall of 2016. Fortunately, I argued to 8. Justice Scalia, rest his soul, had passed away, but I didn't want to argue to him. And so I argued to 8, and we wound up with a 6-2 win with Justice Roberts writing for the majority in a really powerful decision condemning the insertion of race in the criminal legal system.
So, what's so amazing about that case is the fact that it had to go through so many rounds, the fact that it had to go through any round, and then it wasn't until the United States Supreme Court that they accepted it and then finally deemed that this was, as Justice Roberts put it, a noxious stain of racial prejudice, right? Was what he was quoted as saying is that when the final decision went down. But the other thing is that during that term of the U.S. Supreme Court, Christina was the only Black woman to argue in a case in front of the Supreme Court, and to this day, she's one of the few Black women to argue in front of the United States Supreme Court in 2022. So just wanted to point that out as well, and that deserves so So fast forward to the Innocence Project, where you are now. You've had so many tours of duty, if you will. Why the Innocence Project? What led you to there?
Thank you. That's a great question. When I was considering the opportunity to join the Innocence Project, I consult with my daughter on all things, and so I said to her, I was like, well, maybe these people would like me to apply to run the Innocence Project. And I had done such a good job of training her to be the child of a public defender. What she said was, innocent people? No, we don't do innocent people. We represent everybody. You can't focus on the innocent. And I said, wait. So we spent some time talking about it and thinking about it. And really, at the end of the day, right, the goal, and I think every professional decision I have ever made has been about making more impact and broader impact sort of on criminal legal system reform. And ultimately, really upon reflection, it was clear to me that the Innocence Project is, without close second, the most transformative criminal legal system reform organization in American history. It has changed the way everyone looks at the system. When I started practicing in 1993, 94, there just wasn't this clear understanding that we were sending purely innocent people, to prison for decades, right? There was just, it was, do the crime, do the time. It was just a real, right? It was the 90s. There was a war on drugs was going on. It was really, lock 'em up justice. And it wasn't until the Innocence Project started, with science, right? Bringing science, pure science into the system and showing people, right, undisputedly that people who had confessed were innocent. People who had victims identify them in court and on the street were perfectly scientifically innocent. That the entire country really took a totally new look at the criminal legal system. Prosecutors began second guessing, right, the decisions they were making. Am I going to capitally charge this person if I have a little bit of doubt? Jurors began asking those same questions in jury boxes, right? Am I going to impose this death sentence if I have a little bit of doubt? Because now I do have a little bit of doubt. And it's really changed not only the way we look at the system, but it's really changed the way the system functions in terms of the policies and practices utilized by police officers, in terms of the way the defense counsel approaches the case. So it really has ultimately changed the criminal legal system in the way that no other organization in the country ever has. So, upon thinking about it that way, I couldn't imagine no more powerful platform from which to advocate for criminal legal system reform.
What's so amazing about that is, typically in the headlines, we often focus on policing, which is a very important component to focus on. But, every time I talk to you, it just underscores the need to really take more of a holistic view on the criminal legal system. So the Innocence Project is now in its 30th year. Over the past 30 years, the Innocence Project has participated in more than 230 DNA exonerations, and these cases, as Christina has said, has fundamentally transformed our country's understanding of the effectiveness of the criminal legal system. So talk about the focus areas and the strategic pillars.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. There are three fundamental pillars for the work that we are doing right now. The first is that we are committed, obviously, to restoring freedom, right? We have for 30 years dedicated ourselves to using DNA testing and other, and science, bringing science into the criminal legal system to, undisputedly prove that people who have been convicted of crimes have been convicted of crimes wrongly. We're now going to expand our work beyond just DNA cases to non-DNA cases, so we're going to broaden, right, the pool of cases that we will consider and accept for representation. The second pillar of our work is about transforming systems, because we recognize, right, I think one of the most impactful aspects of the work that we do is that it's not enough for us to say we're going to free as many people as we can, and we are doing that, right? But we want to say we want to turn the faucet off at the front end, right? We don't want people coming into the system who are wrongfully, right, who are innocent in the first place. So what we want to do is make sure that we're putting in place policies and practices that prevent innocent people from being convicted in the first place, right? So we look really closely at the lessons from the 230 cases that we've represented, right? And we identify the trends, and we follow the, I'd like to think of it as the breadcrumb trail, right? What are the trends in the cases that we have seen, and what did we find in those trends, right? We found, the majority of the people that we have exonerated were, there were eyewitness identifications. In an enormous number of the cases that we exonerated, there were false confessions, right? We look at these trends, and then we advance an entire, apparatus to change policy around those things, right? So we have advanced and moved legislation and policies around the country, advocating, for example, for us to have experts be allowed to testify in court about the fallibility of eyewitness testimony. We have had, we have worked with police departments around the country to change the way they do literal, eyewitness identification protocols. We've worked with scientists to figure out what is the most accurate way of getting an identification from a stranger, right, one stranger to the other. And so we have an entire department that it's just about policy reform to prevent people from coming into the system in the first place. Right? We are working now, for example, because we know that false confession is a huge problem in wrongful convictions, and we know that children, people with mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities are disproportionately likely to confess to crimes they didn't commit. So our team has been out advocating for reforms. For example, we just had laws passed in Illinois and Utah, and I'm going to mess up my list, the third state, banning, preventing police from lying to children during interrogations, because that is lawful here now in New Jersey. Police can, lie to teenagers when they're being questioned, and that makes them really vulnerable to making confessions and making statements that are not true and getting themselves they make false convictions and get wrongfully convicted. So our second pillar is really about transforming systems so that the entire system is structured to prevent wrongful conviction. And so we have teams of people working on, like I said, preventing deception and interrogation, making sure that there's meaningful accountability in the system, right? That police, for example, who we know to have engaged in consistent misconduct and then are involved, not surprisingly, in wrongful convictions, right? There's transparency around their misconduct, and so that they don't just go off into other jurisdictions to do without any sanction of any kind. So that's the second pillar, is transforming systems. And the third pillar is building the movement, right? Because we know, right, as one organization of 100 or 120 people, the problem of wrongful conviction in this country is so large that I could not scale, whoo, my chair just moved. I could not scale my organization up, right? I couldn't hire, there aren't enough lawyers for me to hire in one organization to address the problem. But there are, smaller innocence projects in various states across the country. So we have an entire team dedicated to capacity building and strengthening those other organizations so that there is a network of people across the country who are partners with us, who are walking lockstep with us to address the problem of wrongful conviction. So those are the three fundamental pillars of our work: restoring freedom, advancing the movement, and transforming systems.
And speaking of movements, in May 25th, 2020, that was the murder of George Floyd, right? Which literally created a movement in the United States and around the world. So as we are approaching the second anniversary of that horrific event, how have things changed in your view?
I think the big change is that I think before George Floyd, people were very reluctant to call something race, right? To call problems race related. And I think, all of us who watched, the horror of George Floyd's murder and, all of the backlash that flowed from it, I think it's made people more open to having a conversation about the role of race and racism in this country, and especially in the criminal legal system. We've seen, corporations take positions and make investments, right, in addressing the problems in the criminal legal system. So I think it is, it was a tragic, horrible, event. I think that, I would like to have seen more reforms, right, like the George Floyd Act. I would have loved to have seen that pass through Congress. It did not, but I think it has softened the ground and made people really much more receptive to the idea that some of the things that we're seeing and some of the injustices that are plaguing the criminal legal system are in fact grounded in the history of, racism and white supremacy in this country.
So when you think about what's happening now and some of the narratives around, critical race theory, for example, what's your reaction to that?
Well, right, what is it? There's always sort of the pendulum, right? With progress, you get the sort of the backlash. Mm-hmm. And so I think we saw a huge, burst forward, and now we're in backlash.
Yeah.
Right? I think history tells that story over and over.
Yeah, and we know that it's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's exactly right.
You mentioned the corporations. I know, through the work that I do at companies, I was at a company at the time when I invited you and other experts, local experts who have become friends of mine to speak very candidly about what was actually happening, and that was something that you had never seen in corporate America, and still continues to this day. And now it's nearly 2 years beyond that. Employees and so many outside of these corporations want to move beyond the conversation to meaningful action. So we still have a long way to go there, but it's so incumbent to have experts like yourself to come in and really expose these organizations to what's actually happening. And speaking of landmark cases, fast forward to November of last year was a pretty big month for the Innocence Project. There were 3 landmark cases. When we were preparing for this interview, her team mentioned that was known as Trifecta Day. The first case, which is the most known from that period, was the exoneration of Malcolm Aziz and Khalil Islam, who were both wrongfully convicted for the murder of Malcolm X back in 1965. And so Christina and her team, along with the Attorney General's Office of New York, helped to turn that conviction around. But there were 2 other cases. Julius Jones, if you could talk about that.
Yeah, it was a remarkable day in November. We were all so excited because my colleagues had worked incredibly hard on the Aziz and Islam cases, which of course were of such historical significance. To see these two, gentlemen who had spent, not just decades in prison, but also carried the stigma, of all these years of having been the assassins of Malcolm X, to see them exonerated in court was an extraordinary day. And so we were, thrilled beyond measure to be in court with them, to have their names cleared finally. But I remember sitting in court and we were all together, those of us from the Innocence Project, and as excited as we were also acutely aware the same day that this exoneration was happening in Manhattan, Julius Jones, who was a gentleman who was sentenced to death in Oklahoma, was scheduled for execution. And Julius Jones is a gentleman who has a very powerful case of innocence that had been litigated, had fought powerfully by members of his family and his community, and our office had supported this campaign. And so we were really struggling with the duality of this particular day, that we were going to see the exoneration of Mr. Islam and Mr. Aziz, and also see the execution of Julius Jones. But while we sat in court, we received the extraordinary news that Julius Jones's death sentence had been commuted by the governor of Oklahoma. And so we were thrilled. And so we sat through this amazing proceeding in Manhattan, where the New York County District Attorney, who did participate with us in the reinvestigation of the case, stood in court and, apologized, and, the judge exonerated Mr. Islam and Mr. Aziz, and we returned to the office, and it happened that we were having, what was the end of the year, I think we were having some cookie event in the office, and as we were all gathering for that, we then learned that another of the clients that we had been working on, whose cases we had been working on, a gentleman by the name of Purvis Payne, who was sentenced to death in Tennessee, and similarly, enormous evidence of innocence. We worked closely on DNA testing and other investigation on that case, and that day was announced that the district attorney announced that he would no longer seek the death penalty for Mr. Payne. So it was an extraordinary, we called it the trifecta of justice. It was a really amazing day.
That's amazing. So when I was preparing for this interview today, there are obviously, the cases that we hear about and that we read about in the headlines, and I was scrolling through Facebook today, as I often do, and came across a friend's post, and it was a blog. She was sharing a blog that the Innocence Project had posted today about Melissa Lucio, who is another extraordinary case, and our friend was like, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know about this case until today. So talk to us about that.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful question, and I'm happy to answer it today. So Melissa Lucio is a mother of 12. She lived and lives in Texas. One day, one of her small children fell down a set of stairs while they were in the process of moving. She didn't think much of it. They moved, but then 2 days later, the child, was struggling to wake up, and unfortunately, the child passed away. In the wake of the death of this toddler, there was no investigation done, and all of the attention was focused on the mother of this toddler, Melissa Lucio, who was then questioned immediately, right after the trauma of losing her child, who was 2 years old. Faced brutal and intense interrogation by the police, which there's video of it available online. You can find it on our website, where she's consistently told and threatened by the police that, that she killed her child, and she asserts over 100 times during the course of this interrogation that she most certainly did not. Nonetheless, she was arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and condemned to death for the murder of this child. She's been on death row since then, and we got involved in the case more recently. She had an execution date scheduled for Wednesday of this week, and my office has worked incredibly hard getting, experts who reviewed her medical history, as well as, sort of all her social history to document and explain, for example, that this is a child who had a history of falls. And so she had a medical history that predated this event that explained, right, the fall down the stairs and how that fall down the stairs could have led to this catastrophic, and tragic, but not criminal death. And this evidence was presented to, the governor, to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, and to courts. And until about 2 o'clock this afternoon, we were anticipating an execution on Wednesday, but thankfully today the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals announced a stay of execution and ordered a hearing on the evidence of innocence that has been put together by my office.
So amazing. So earlier during our conversation, I said, when we were talking about Buck versus Davis, I said that you're, to this day, one of the few Black women in the history of the United States Supreme Court to argue in front of the Supreme Court. And just a few short weeks ago, Katanji Brown-Jackson, it was voted to be confirmed as a United States Supreme Court Justice. So as someone who has not only argued in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, but also in certain circles that I will not name, has been on a short list of potential nominees herself. What is your reaction to her confirmation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a historic day for so many reasons. The first answer to the question is, of course, because representation matters, right? Because I want my daughter to look up and believe, without question, that if she wants to sit on the United States Supreme Court, that is something that she can and should aspire to do, and not have an asterisk, right? And not have a question on that idea. So I think that's huge. I also, think I'm a public defender by training, and she did some time as a public defender. So for me, having that experience on the court is also huge. It's unusual across the bench to have a person with criminal defense experience sit on as a judge, serve as a judge in this country. And so to have that experience on the United States Supreme Court is huge. She would be the second only to Thurgood Marshall, who wasn't a public defender, but of course did extensive, time representing Black men in the South who were either charged with or convicted of capital crimes as well. So she becomes only the second person with that band of experience. And for those of us that are, advocating for people in the criminal legal system, it is so important to have someone who sees our clients as human beings and understands what it is like to stand beside someone who has, been convicted of truly horrible crimes. And is able to sort of see past the crime to the human being, hopefully, right, and judge the facts and the law, past the horror. And I think that having the experience of doing that, is a unique experience in the world. And so I think it is something that she will bring with her to her decision making. Is she going to rule for us and the defense every time? No, she won't. I don't expect that. But I think having that imbue her decision-making and having her, I think more importantly, in chambers, talking to her colleagues about what it's like to stand beside someone who has been condemned, someone who has admitted to terrible crimes matters. And I think that will influence the way the court views the cases.
Absolutely. So shifting gears, how do you, there's so many macro issues that we could talk about all day, but what are your thoughts as someone, who lives locally, how these macro issues show up locally in our community?
They show up in so many ways. The first answer I always give to people who say, well, what can I do? It's, the first answer is always serve on a jury, right? We're all going to get called. We're all going to get that terrible notice in the mail. And then we're all going to think of ways that we can say, I went to Christina Swarns' talk, so I can't serve. But that is not what you should do. That is the wrong answer, right? You should not do that, right? Because what we need is every single one of you to sit in the room and say, I did hear things about wrongful conviction, and I want, we need that skepticism in the jury room, not to say, you shouldn't be fair. You should, of course, be fair. right? But you should bring the knowledge that you know about wrongful conviction with you into the jury room, right, as you consider the case fairly, right? So my number one answer is, right, serve on juries. Do not use all of your relationships with police and prosecutors to get excused, right? Take the time and serve, because we need you out there. Because if this community doesn't serve, trust me, there is another community that will serve, and that's how we sort of wind up with really extreme results. The second answer I always give to sort of folks about what they can do is vote, right? I mean, there's no more powerful decision that way of communicating a community's values, is by how we vote, right? And how we, who we encourage to seek political office, right? And making sure you hold them accountable. So those are the two things I start with. But that said, right, here in Maplewood, this is an extraordinary community that all of us have moved to for the values and the values, right? This is a community that is really rooted in values, and I think all of us came here sort of because we believed in the values of this community. And I certainly did and do. But we've also seen circumstances where, as we are all going to, right, there have been shortfalls on the values, right? The recent disclosure of the use of force, the use of force by the police department, leading the state, is a shortfall of the highest order, right? And so that, for me, as a person that represents people who are innocent, right, is a red flag, because if the use of force is happening on the street, I worry about what's happening again in the interrogations, right? Because I know that people, vulnerable people confess to crimes they don't commit. And so the evidence of the, disproportionate use of force is a real problem for this community, and it really does directly relate to, wrongful convictions and the work of the Innocence Project. And there are other examples, that we could go through, but I think that, we just have to be clear that when these things come up, right, we as a community have to say that this is not who we are, this is not how we're going to function, and we have to vote it and make it clear that that's who we are as a community.
Absolutely. Speaking of our community, another landmark milestone that happened just last week was the recreational use of marijuana in New Jersey. So as somebody who has, worked in the criminal justice system for your entire career, when you think about the fact that on the one hand, one of the key drivers for mass incarceration in this country has been, Black and brown people, just simply for the possession of marijuana. And then you fast forward to last week when recreational use is now legalized. What's your reaction to that?
I live not far from the apothecarium, and it was tough getting home that last week. There's a lot of traffic out there. I assume it'll stay that way, and good, I'm glad. But the first thing, of course, I think there are people in prison still today, right, on convictions for possession and sale of marijuana, when now, around the corner from me and, this tony little, suburb, I could just go over there and buy some at will, and so we just, as a country, right, we need to be more consistent, right? It's crazy to have, people incarcerated for decades on possession of, a substance that I can now buy, right, on Springfield Avenue. And it's just outrageous, honestly.
Yeah. So we're running short on time, and I want to leave room for questions if people have them. So, but I would be remiss. I mean, the last couple of years have been really challenging for millions of people around the world. When you think about the pandemic, the racial reckoning that we talked about, the January 6th, 2021 event. We didn't even get into that. So, and then, on top of that, your career, you are impacting people's lives in such a profound way, the work that you and your team does, and it's really difficult. And, racism is exhausting, right? So, and I don't say that lightly. So what brings you joy? And, how do you sort of stay up when there's so many things that could bring you down?
So that's such a good question. So I will talk about it first institutionally, because it's actually an institutional commitment I think I have as a leader of an organization that does, such incredibly difficult work where we are confronted all the time with vicarious and secondary trauma. So we actually have a psychiatrist that works with our organization. She comes in and she does the senior leadership team meets with her quarterly, right? And we just sit on the phone and vent, all of the things about how our colleagues have driven us insane. Not true, we love them, but maybe we say that. And the same with each of the departments. They have an opportunity to meet with the psychiatrist and talk about the ways that the work is wearing, on them, and think about ways that we can be intentional about sort of building a reservoir of strength so we can continue to do the work that we do. And so it's really built into the organization itself, right? So we try very hard. So this week, as we were expecting this execution, she has been on site and on call, ready for us to meet with her in the event that this execution went forward. So we are really intentional at the organization about self-care and making sure that as we do this extraordinarily difficult work that we don't always win, that we are going to get through it as intact as we humanly possibly can. So that's professionally. Personally, I have always believed for most of my career that it's really important, when I do this, I do, really difficult work, and it takes up a lot of my time. But I also have a part of my life that has nothing to do with the Innocence Project, right? I have a group of friends who are my friends largely because they have children my daughter's age, because we watch the same reality television shows, who have not, and I really, I say that in jest, but it's true. And I really do commit to this idea of having a space, right, sort of a foot out of the world of the criminal legal system, where I'm just, Amina's mom, or I'm just Karen's backdoor neighbor, and I'm just like a regular person who needs to, straighten up her deck, which my daughter did this weekend, Karen. So, I really do, prioritize having space in my life where I'm not, the avenger of criminal legal system, right? I'm just relaxing and watching HBO, or just hanging out with my friends, or just in town.
My last question is, going back to the Supreme Court nomination hearings for soon-to-be Supreme Court Justice Jackson, there was that New York Times photo that went viral, right, of her daughter, just looking at her mom, in such an admiring way. And you and I both have daughters. And the other thing that stood out for me beyond that photo was Senator Booker's testimony, when he kept saying to her, I know what it took for you to sit in that seat, right? So when you think about, the next generation, starting with your daughter, what advice do you have for her and the next generation, so that they will continue to, so that they can have the strength to sit in whatever chair they want to sit in, regardless of the challenges that they're going to face?
My first answer is this next generation is already way out ahead of us. My goodly, right? They are asking and making demands and seeing the world so far beyond the way we have seen it that I'm just all, here all for it. I'm like, do that. Do not be limited by don't let my vision limit you, right? I am astonished by the expectations and the asks and the way that they see the world, beyond limits. And so that's my first answer, is to just keep leaning into that, because, they have to push us, right, to go further. And I think they're doing an amazing job of doing that already. And so I encourage her, go, speak out, speak your truth, see the world as boundless, right? Because it really can be if you see it that way.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Maureen.
We are going to... So I believe we have some time for questions. So if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, feel free. Yes.
Well, thank you for the work that you do. It's amazing. I have two parts. Was the Innocence Project involved at all with Curtis Flowers' case? And also, do you ever work, or I'm sure you do, closely with one of my heroes, besides this guy, Brian Stevenson?
So we were not involved in the Curtis Flowers case, but wow, what an extraordinary case that was. And I think it's a powerful lesson in so many ways. And I don't know if everyone should listen to the podcast In the Dark. If you have not listened to it, I think that's season 2 of In the Dark. It is the most compelling story of this death penalty case out of Mississippi that ultimately goes to the United States Supreme Court, and the death sentences, well, spoiler alert, the death sentence is vacated. But it is a winding, extraordinary road of multiple trial after trial after trial. You know, one of the things I think there's so much to be said about that case. The thing that always stands out for me around this issue of race and the criminal legal system is Curtis Flowers is tried, I want to say 6 times, thank you. And 5 of the 6 times he is tried by all white juries. The only time that the jury hangs, and he is, I should just say, again, spoiler alert, he is innocent. The only time that the jury doesn't automatically conclude that he is guilty is when they have a mixed jury. And this becomes the story of this case, this prosecutor who consistently works very hard to make sure that no black people sit on this jury. And so it's a fascinating case. I wish I could take credit for it, but I cannot. It was amazing litigation, Brian Stevenson, he's a friend. He was ahead of me, but the community of people that do post-conviction death penalty work is relatively small. And so, we have collaborated and conspired and been co-conspirators on many, projects over the years. He is all the extraordinary that you already know that he is. He's also very funny and very kind and has always just been, willing to be a mentor, certainly to me, at every stage along the way. I mean, what he has done and what he has built is, is just unbelievable. And so he is all the things that you think he is, and also really nice to boot.
Yes.
Can you estimate the percentage of wrongful convictions that might be part of that justice system? If you can, is there a reason that prosecutors and police work so hard to get a conviction, regardless of whether it's just or unjust? And finally, does any of that lead into a way to overturn the death penalty?
Great questions. So hundreds of thousands is generally the estimate. Hundreds of thousands of people are wrongfully convicted. I can't remember the percentage, but hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's a lot of people are estimated to be wrongfully convicted in this country. I think police, there are always terrible police and prosecutors. There are always people right out there that are just bad. But I think the really people who are just bad are the minority. Right? I think what happens in many instances is that there is sort of tunnel vision, right? I mean, there is an obvious suspect or somebody that somebody perceives to be an obvious suspect. And, sort of the whole apparatus is then directed, focused on that one person to the exclusion of all these other people. And so you don't get a genuine, a thorough investigation because what happens is just efforts are made to confirm the suspicion, right? And so that's sort of what happens. So I try not to, take a, sweeping brush with police and prosecutors and say they're all just terrible, because I don't think that anybody sets out, like I said, there's a minority of people that are just bad. But I don't really think that most people just set out to convict or to arrest an innocent person, right? I think people are trying to do their job, and then terrible mistakes are made along the way. I think it starts getting harder when they sort of fight us in the undoing of them, right? Because what I don't understand, for example, is that prosecutors or police departments, and mostly prosecutors, who oppose DNA testing, like, right, we'll pay for it. Let's just be clear. The Innocence Project, there will be no cost to any state, right, on a case that we bring. We come in, we will pay for the whole thing. right? If you are certain and clear in your, conviction of this person, then there is no risk to you for having my office come and test DNA that happens to be in your possession, right? It'll just confirm your theory. But that, unfortunately, is not what happens. Time and again, we have prosecuting attorneys' offices fight us tooth and nail on turning over the material and allowing us to test it. Again, even though it's of no cost to them, we have to get court orders, and there's just ongoing litigation around this. So that I find, indefensible, period, right? If you believe your conviction, then you shouldn't be concerned about letting us test the evidence, right? They will all say this is about finality, we have to bring things to an end. Again, it doesn't matter, right? If I'm doing the testing and, I will, right, you'll have access to the test results, let's find out. And if you're confirmed, you're confirmed. It doesn't matter. And if not, then the person should be freed. For the death penalty, I think the whole proof of innocence has undermined, right, confidence in the death penalty, globally. I think there's 100 and, oh my gosh, I'm going to get my numbers, 180 or so people have been exonerated from death row in this country. And so, the idea that, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty in 1972 and reinstated it in 1976, saying that the new statutes, unlike the ones that predated it, were able to identify, properly the worst of the worst offenders, and it assumed a system that was able to, properly, accurately identify who the perpetrators were, right? So you identify who did it and able to say that the person who did it is actually the worst of people in this country, right? And what we have seen, right, through the exonerations, through the evidence of, the horrendous counsel people have received on death row, right? There are tales of sleeping lawyers and drunk lawyers, through the evidence of, the cases of involving withholding of evidence of innocence, through cases involving, just horrendous bad behavior, that's the system isn't working as it was designed to, right? Over and over and over again. So I think, the advantage of the innocence cases is they do get an enormous amount of attention, right? And so, as do death penalty cases. So the convergence of them sort of, I think, has just really brought a fair amount of skepticism to the system. And so what we have seen, right, as these cases have, over the last 30 years, have sort of emerged into public consciousness, is we've seen the number of executions in the country drop, and public support for the death penalty has also dropped along with it. So I think that's, again, why I say the Innocence Project is the most transformative criminal legal system reform organization in the country, because it's that, people in the system will tell you, it's that arc is really about people being afraid of sending innocent people to prison and to the death chamber.
I think we have time for our last question.
Yes. First, I want to say that when I think of Christina Swarns, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you directed litigation that got Lucio off the death row. So that
Also true.
stood out in my mind for years, and I was thrilled when I saw your photo. You were going to be speaking here. I have a question, though, about the Innocence Project work, and I'm curious about whether or not you all have looked at this. It's my understanding, and I've looked at this pretty closely, that a large proportion of the people that have been exonerated by the Innocence Project were exonerated for sex offenses. That may be somewhat because of the reliance on biological evidence and so forth and so on. But other people argue that, in fact, people who are charged with sex offenses have a disproportionate likelihood of being wrongfully convicted because of the stigma associated with the offenses. Prior to you coming to Maplewood, it was a big wrongful conviction here in Maplewood, where a woman was charged with multiple sex offenses at a daycare center. And she went to prison, was in prison for many years before she was exonerated. But the concern about the crime created a certain atmosphere that led to the type of investigative difficulties that you described. So the question I'm asking is, usually you hear a lot of talk about false confessions, which are a major problem, the witness misidentifications, which are a major problem, and the unreliable forensic evidence, which is also a major problem. But certain offenses, it seems to me, and I've looked at it, seem to be increase the risk of wrongful conviction. Have you all thought about that?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I'll start at the beginning. The majority of our cases have been rape or murder because at its inception, the Innocence Project focused solely on DNA exoneration. So you had to have biological, right? It's a criteria for us accepting your case is there has to be a way for us to get biological evidence and, test it to exoneration. So that's the reason you see in our office that the majority of the cases are rape murder cases. The majority of wrongful conviction cases are high profile and serious violent felonies. I think that's also true, but I would say I think there just hasn't been a lot of, there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to the fact, which I also believe absolutely firmly, that thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people are convicted of much less serious crimes, right, who are innocent. And I think that problem is actually even larger in scale than, the serious violent felonies because, people will plead guilty to misdemeanors because they have to go home, right, because it's easy to do that. And you feel like, I can carry a misdemeanor and it's not going to be that harmful, but the scale of that problem is, is so big and so vast. I think people have been loath to even figure out how you begin to engage on that scale of problem because I think that happens at a rate that, astonishingly eclipses the serious and violent felonies. But I think you're right, of course. You get a horrible every case I have ever represented, and I have before going to the Innocence Project and at the Innocence Project have, only represented people convicted of murder or something like murder for a long time. These are all really high profile cases that have shocked the community, every single one of them, right? And so you're right, you get all of the pressure, the anxiety of a community under a terrified community, right? The pressure on a police department to produce a rapid result, the pressure on a prosecutor, right, to get a conviction. You can't imagine, right, after this catastrophic event, that this person who's been identified is going to go home, right, and go back into the community. And so all of that absolutely plays into, right, all of that pressure cooker environment invites, error. Right? Because you don't have the objective distance anymore that you really need, right, to investigate these cases accurately. And so I think that is a huge factor and contributes to why we see, right, so many wrongful convictions of serious violent felonies.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
live in Maplewood with both of you, and I just think that what you do is so incredible, so thank you. I also wanted just to welcome everybody back, because we've got great programs throughout this week, and tomorrow, as I said at the beginning, we have Tim Wang in conversation with John Gertner. On Wednesday, Nancy Solomon of WNYC will be receiving the Carol Buchanan Award, and she'll be in conversation with Deborah Goldstein. And on Thursday, Ibby Zavoy, and Ibby is right here, Maplewood Literary Award, and that will be at Town Hall at 7 p.m. on Thursday. And finally, we close out the week with Amanda Gonzalez, who stars in Hamilton, and she'll be also at Town Hall at 3:30 on Friday. So I hope we'll see you again, and thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.